Good evening and welcome to this New Israel Fund Australia event. My name is Robin Schwartz and I'm a member of NIF's Advisory Council. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that although we are meeting virtually, we are always physically on Aboriginal land. And because of that, I pay my respects to elders past and present. Before I introduce tonight's discussion on the new Biden-Harris administration's likely foreign policy agenda in the Middle East, I want to talk to you very briefly about NIF and why I've been a committed supporter for many years. Most of you probably know that NIF is a partnership between Israel and diaspora Jews to uphold the value of Israel's Declaration of Independence, values that promote a more inclusive, just and equitable Israel for everyone who lives there. Today, there is hardly a project in civil society in Israel which promotes these shared values that has not partnered with or been funded by NIF at some point in its history. I think that's a very impressive achievement. These values and a grassroots approach to effecting change sit perfectly with my own values and approach in my professional and personal life. Just as I support and am committed to promoting inclusion, justice and equity for all Australians, I can do the same for those living in Israel by supporting NIF. NIF provides a way for me to show my love for and commitment to Israel in a manner that absolutely resonates with my own value system. But now to our timely event, just 2 weeks after the historic inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. The world is waiting to see their foreign policy priorities, and we tonight are focusing on the Middle East. We want to share with you the thinking of two experienced commentators who can provide insights around a range of issues in the region, including how will Biden re-engage Iran? What next for the Abraham Accords? Will the new administration focus on resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and stop the de facto annexations that are happening on the ground? We've also included a number of questions from the audience, you the audience. Our two panellists have a wealth of knowledge between them. I won't give their full bios, but in short, Aaron David Miller is a former State Department analyst and advisor to both Republican and Democratic governments. He is an author, a global affairs analyst and a commentator, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also a member of NIF's global board. Ksenia Svetlova is a Russian-born, Arabic-speaking former journalist and author. She was a Knesset member for the Zionist Union. She is also an expert in Middle Eastern affairs and is currently the director of the Mitvim Institute for Foreign Policy Program on Israel-Middle East relations and a senior research fellow at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. They will be in conversation with our very own Liam Getreu, Executive Director of NIF Australia, who will be moderating the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for opening up tonight's event. I'm sure that why you support NIF will resonate with many of our supporters. My name's Liam Getreu. I'm the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund in Australia, and it's my pleasure to also welcome both Ksenia and Aaron joining us from opposite sides of the world, and to really thank them for joining with us tonight as well. We've got a lot to cover. After 4 years of Donald Trump, we've seen turbulence and disruption in some pretty extraordinary ways. We could spend forever talking about fake claims of election fraud, of corruption, ineptitude, and more. But tonight we're going to take just an hour to talk about Israel and the Middle East. In these 4 years, Trump moved the US Embassy in Jerusalem. He surprised allies by withdrawing troops from Syria. He encouraged the growth of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and helped to strike normalization deals between Israel and its Arab neighbors. We've got more than 500 people joining us tonight, and I want to thank everyone who sent in questions. We're going to cover a lot of ground tonight as part of our chat with Aaron and Ksenia as we talk about the landscape that faces Joe Biden. So, Aaron, I might jump in straight away with you. It's hard to sometimes untangle domestic and foreign policy issues, and maybe even harder given the significance of the last 4 years. But maybe you can start by giving us a bit of an introduction to what kind of scenario you see Joe Biden landing in his first few days in office.
I mean, I think, Liam, you asked the critical question, at least from an American point of view. And frankly, these days I start my analysis on things Middle Eastern for some time now, not in the Middle East, but in Washington, because I've increasingly been convinced, having worked for half a dozen secretaries of state and a half a dozen administrations, that the United States responds in large part based on the choices and priorities of presidents and other realities on their agenda. And I would only say to your viewers, and I think it really needs to be repeated over and over again, Joe Biden, the 46th president of the United States, faces the greatest challenge of domestic recovery of any American president since Franklin Roosevelt. Some would say, and have said, since Abraham Lincoln. There are at least 4 or 5 inextricably linked crises, which involve the greatest threat to public health since the Great Influenza, an economic crisis that has potential to be ameliorated, but in an era of polarization is going to be extremely difficult to do so. You have effective tribalization and polarization of American politics. You have a degree of civil unrest, demonstrations not seen in decades in this country. You have a former president who continues to want to create and is finding wonderful resonance among many members of the political elite, as well as the millions of Americans who voted for him, for a different reality. And these are the challenges. These are the priorities. These are the metrics by which Joe Biden's success or failure will be judged. So my opening note of caution is that the Middle East, while important, is simply not as important as it used to be. And Mr. Biden and his team may well find themselves drawn in, but American priorities are changing. And I think it's, if in fact there was any sense or hope on the part of Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians that the Biden administration is going to somehow practice some form of redemption to help them resolve their problems, I think the bandwidth for doing this is going to be exceedingly limited. Not that foreign policy will not be important, but domestic priorities will rule.
Is that, Ksenia, the feeling in Israel? There was a big shift maybe between the world that embraced Trump in Israel versus this kind of new reality that maybe Israel's not on the agenda in the way that Donald Trump had placed it?
First of all, I would like to say that it's good to be here and really great, that we are having this conversation. I think it's extremely important to understand the differences in priorities and agendas, and also the very specific view from Israel on the events, the fateful events in the United States. The Israeli perspective is usually, it's very narrow, specifically Israeli perspective, Middle Eastern perspective. And most of the Israelis are only looking at the President of the United States from this position. Is it good to Israel or if it's bad? So although I think that the decision makers, of course, understand that in the current situation, given the economic crisis, the health crisis, the immense trauma, which, in my assessment, were the 4 years of Donald Trump to America, the domestic agenda must be primary, of course, to the everything international, and also international agenda. There is China, there is Russia, and plenty of other things. And yet, I think that the Israelis are looking at Biden, first of all, through the lens of what he will do in Iran. This is the perspective, this is the fear, and this will be the maximum effort from the current Israeli government. I don't know what will be the future Israeli government. Hopefully it will be a different one. To try to understand, where is the White House is heading to, and regarding to this position, also to work out an Israeli modus vivendi, whether it will be a confrontational one or it will be, an attempt to adapt to the current reality in the White House and to work with the American administration in order to basically, protect Israel and to bring in the Israeli perspective. Right now, I think we are more inclining to the confrontational mode. At least, these are the words that we have been hearing from the sphere of close aides to Benjamin Netanyahu. And although it's well known here in Israel that Biden is Biden, he is not Mr. Obama number two. And the conflict between the two leaders doesn't necessarily has to be inherited by Biden administration. And still, for now, it seems like we are heading to the confrontation around the Iranian dossier and the future moves that will be undertaken by the American administration.
We're definitely going to talk a lot about Iran and the confrontation that maybe is coming up. Aaron, do you think that the perception that the world has of the United States has changed over the last 4 years? Is there not only because of the crisis that's currently happening, but the way that Donald Trump has treated allies, the way that he's the nature of his diplomacy is maybe the polite way to say it. Has that changed the effectiveness that America kind of as an idea, as an institution, as a leader can have? Or will it be a snapback with a more kind of conventional presidency from Joe Biden?
It's an excellent question. COVID is arguably the most world-altering event since the Second World War. And rather than create new realities, COVID, I think, has, in many respects, reinforced existing realities. The rise of populism, a range of anti-democratic forces, the resurgence of nationalism, anti-globalization, and more important, in my judgment, it has reinforced the trend of competition between the so-called great powers, particularly Russia and China and the United States. I think U.S. leadership in the world has been readjusting over the last several decades to a situation where the notion of a unipolar world in which America emerges as the dominant power, well, frankly, that has gone the way of the dodo. Fareed Zakaria talks about the rise of the rest. And I think it's fair to say that the challenge for the Biden administration, frankly, the challenge for the previous three administrations, particularly in the wake of Iraq and Afghanistan and 9/11, is to adjust to that new world. The U.S. is no longer what one of my former bosses, Madeleine Albright, referred to as the indispensable power, willing and able and dedicated and motivated to commit itself to solving problems great and small in the world. And nor is the American view promoted of a liberal international order. It may be increasingly fraught in the world that we inherited. But what has happened in the last 4 years, Liam, and I think I'll just conclude with this thought, never have I seen the dysfunction of the United States at home, the tribalization, the polarization of politics, the threat to democracy embodied in that extraordinary day on January 6th, that bloody stained day of January 6th, our inability to cope, to manage COVID-19. Never have I seen that dysfunction more displayed for all the world to see. And the impact of that dysfunction has taken an enormous hit on the American image, on American credibility, and on America's reputation, not only as a democracy, but as an effective polity that is able to address its problems. And this is an extraordinary situation for the United States to be in. I think there is a great chance of recovery to some degree, but remember, recovery toward what? If you're talking about recovery toward a world in which the liberal international order is going to prevail and the United States will sit at the head of the table and others will follow, that's not the kind of world that Joe Biden is inheriting. You know what they say about a leader without followers is just a guy out for a walk. And I don't doubt our capacity and resiliency, but I think we're going to have to accept certain limitations on our capacity to transform this international environment.
I mean, I wonder how that will kind of play out. I guess it's going to be interesting to see how other countries react. Israel, certainly among them. The Iran deal is where I want to talk about now. And Ksenia, you mentioned the kind of maybe a looming confrontation that's coming. You also said, which I thought was interesting, that Joe Biden isn't necessarily Barack Obama 2.0, but much of his core team is the same. It's in fact very similar, almost exactly the kind of makeup. The people who came out of the Obama administration are still very involved now in the Biden administration. How much resistance is Netanyahu going to continue now to a re-engagement with Iran? It seems like it's the major foreign policy initiative that Joe Biden is going to pursue. There's already rumblings in Israel from senior military staff, and I think Benny Gantz just a few hours ago came out and said that he wants to make sure that the Israeli military option is still on the table. Are they really going to push? Are they going to fight as much as we saw Netanyahu fight last time?
So it seems that Netanyahu certainly has a problem because he sees the nominations of the close members of Biden team, and specifically Rob Malley, for somebody who was going to take care of the Iranian dossier. And he's probably wondering, am I back to 2009? It seems that, first of all, he has this problem. And second problem is that the Israeli public is not that interested in the Iranian file as it used to be back in 2009, 2010, 2011. We see it, according to the public polls, we see it in sociological studies, because as in every country around the globe, also the Israelis are first and most of all, right now they are involved with and they are preoccupied with their domestic crisis, job market, the weakness of the economy, the lack of some kind of visibility, about the decisions that are made around the corona crisis, and the Iranian file is just not one of them. So if Netanyahu thought that he can use this confrontation mode before the elections of 23rd of March, it seems that it will be very hard to bring back the Iranian threat and to put it on the agenda, on the domestic agenda, as it used to be 10 years ago, because the things had, they changed. And also he himself had said time and again that Israel's situation has never been better. Look at the Abrahamic Accords. Look at the peace with the, Emirates and Bahrain. So suddenly, we are back to the Iranian threat that he basically stopped talking about for the last couple of years. So there are, there are these two issues that right now I think they are of much concern to Netanyahu. I think that what we have seen from also the head of staff, Aviv Kochavi, Benny Gantz, Netanyahu himself, everything indicates that as a man that also they are men of military power, they're men of power, they would like to, use this theme, and to make it one of the major, things on the Israeli agenda. Well, whether they will be able to do it, I think there is a lot of, weight there for the public opinion, and whether public opinion will support confrontation between Netanyahu and the American president. And I'm not sure that this is the case right now.
I mean, that's fascinating to think that it really was the dominant issue for so long, and for it to kind of be pushed down the agenda, whether because of kind of corona issues or because of the successes actually within the neighborhood, is very interesting. You mentioned Rob Malley, who the president has appointed as his envoy. Aaron, am I right that you worked with him for a long time? In fact, I actually think that a couple of days ago on Twitter, I saw a photo of you perhaps at Camp David with him and Dennis Ross and I think Gilad Sher and a whole bunch of Israeli negotiators as well. his appointment's been attacked by hawks in the Republican Party for being perceived as too dovish and I guess the military, the establishment in Washington not liking the choice. But I get the feeling, again, it's just more of the same. We kind of know which direction Joe Biden's going to want to go because we have the Obama years as a blueprint. Is it going to be all that different? Is it going to be a re-entry?
Since this is going to be primarily a Jewish audience, let me just make a point or two here which needs to be made. The last time I looked, the Constitution talks about the president as the commander-in-chief. Joe Biden has assembled a team, and anyone who is the least bit surprised by this team hasn't been paying attention. The president, shackled with the kind of domestic agenda that Joe Biden faces, is going to choose people he knows he trusts and people who can seamlessly move from the private sector or whatever else they've been doing. Most of these people are my friends, into government on day one. And by the way, it's not a wash, rinse, and repeat cycle from Obama. Many of these people, including Tony Blinken, Toria Nuland, Wendy Sherman, Bill Burns, a close friend of mine who's going to be CIA director if he's confirmed, they go back to the Clinton administration. So that's point number one. Joe Biden will set the tone, the policy, and even, I suspect, given his deep involvement in the Iran issue and foreign policy, the tactics, not Rob Malley. But let me say something else, and I'll speak very openly and candidly here. The team I was associated with for almost 20-some years working on Arab-Israeli negotiations went through this process that Rob has gone through. Attacks from Arabs, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Israelis, the worst kind of ad hominem and invective. We were at the same time accused of being self-hating Jews on one hand and Zionists on steroids on the other. And most of this criticism, frankly, the worst of it, there was an enormous amount of anti-Semitism, I must say, from the Arabs and from the Palestinians. But the worst criticism, by far, my wife Lindsay has kept a letter file back in the old days when there was no email. The worst criticism by far came from American Jews and Israelis. Usually Israelis predisposed to a sort of conservative bent. But it was venomous, it was hateful, and it was stunningly, in my judgment, misplaced. It's almost as if Jews have a very difficult time processing the reality that other Jews whose loyalties, primarily loyalties, in this case, may lie with the advancement of American national interests, they have a very hard time accepting the fact that these fellow religionists, co-religionists, could somehow participate in government and advance policies that first and foremost attend to the interests of the United States without, frankly, and I would challenge anyone in the last 20 plus years to point to any example of an American administration sacrificing Israeli national interests on the altar of expediency in order to please the Arabs. I call this the cosmic oy vey syndrome. It's the inability of, not all, by far, it's the inability of many Jews, to look at the fact that Israel and the United States have an extraordinarily close relationship and that there should be any daylight between them. But in essence, how can there not be daylight between them? America has non-predatory neighbors, the Canadians and the Mexicans to their north and south, and fish. to their east and west, what one historian brilliantly called our liquid assets. Israel is sitting on top of a volcano. It's a small power. It's a regional superpower, but in comparison to the United States, it's a small power. And I think it's by definition, those interests are going to diverge. But what strikes me finally, sorry to drone on here, what strikes me finally is what unites and coheres U.S. and Israel is far more important and resonant than what divides us. So if there are divisions, relate to them in a reasonable, normal fashion, because this country should not be embarrassed in the least for the support that it has provided the state of Israel over the last 70 plus years.
I definitely want to talk about what it means to be an ally of the United States, and we're going to talk about that soon when it comes to kind of the regional issues and the Abraham initiatives. But Ksenia, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about your perception of that. I love, Aaron, your idea of the cosmic oy vey syndrome. Ksenia, did you want to chime in on that issue?
Well, first of all, I just want to add very briefly that about this hateful reactions and this perception of America as somebody who has to give things to Israel, who has to cooperate with Israel, who has to accommodate to Israel. This sense had grown during the 10 years of Benjamin Netanyahu's rule in Israel. And the incitement that exists here towards the left wing in general, and specifically towards everybody who were sympathetic and willing to negotiate, cooperate with the Obama administration, you can even add even more to that, 10 times more, and then you will see, you will get what the establishment in Israel, the ruling establishment, and it's not necessarily even the right-wing establishment, it's Netanyahu establishment, feels towards the new administration in White House. This proportion, perhaps, of a small power, important power, an American ally versus, the superpower that is one of the decisive powers on our globe. It simply does not exist. It doesn't exist this way. And now I think the awakening has begun. This is a new era, and I think that the awakening from the 4 years of Trump mirage in the desert, it will be quite painful, and therefore the confrontation that I was talking about, it's inevitable, and perhaps the new examination of the relations and of Israel's place in this ecosystem, it's inevitable. Again, we do not know what will be the next government in Israel, whether it will be Netanyahu's government or it will be a new one. I doubt, however, that the relation towards the understanding that Trump and his ideas and his activities were good for Israel, while Obama or Biden's are not, whether it will be change significantly.
I want to talk about the kind of regional deals that both of you have hinted at a little bit, because it does seem to be an area that many or even most people think that President Trump and I guess Jared Kushner as well did a pretty good job of arranging these normalization deals. I think we need to bear in mind that they were bubbling away for a while. I don't think, Trump and Kushner kind of clicked their fingers and suddenly there are normalization deals that were created. Ksenia, you've spent a long time in the Middle East. I think I read that you've reported from Lebanon and in Syria and Libya, and you've been in Gaza interviewing the then Hamas leader just a couple of weeks before he was assassinated in a target assassination. Your book, which my understanding is not yet out in English, called On Heels in the Middle East, sounds amazing. Very much hoping that comes out in English soon. Did these deals come as a surprise to you? Was this a development that you saw kind of coming in the pipeline? It needed maybe something to tip it over the edge, or were you kind of a bit dumbfounded by how it came about?
Well, I can tell you that we knew that something is going on, and yet it was a surprise. So this is this kind of situation in which you know that for 20 years or even more, you have these developments that only the blind man could perhaps not see what is going on. Because I know there's hundreds of Israelis that have been to the Gulf during the recent years. There was this story in 2002 in one of the Saudi newspapers before the war, before the incursion to Iraq, that if Israel will be attacked by Saddam Hussein, then Israel would be able to use the airspace, the Saudi airspace. So this is 2002. And the trend in the Gulf newspapers, specifically in those that are being printed in elsewhere, in London or elsewhere, like Sharq al-Awsat, you couldn't miss it, So we saw that since 2007, perhaps, since after the war in Lebanon, there has been more and more understanding that, Israel is not the enemy. The enemy is Iran. So Israel is a party with which we actually should cooperate. And I can show you the op-eds that were published during that time, 2007, 8, 9, before the Arab Spring. And of course, the catalyst to this, to everything, was the Arab Spring and the weakness of the Arab system, disintegration of many countries in the Arab world. Although we felt that things are moving, and Netanyahu himself was not shy about it. Since 2018, he used to tell us. I was in the Knesset at the time, and he was telling, time after time, that there is a chance for normalization with these countries. So everybody thought that he was bragging about it. Frankly, I was surprised by the speed with which the Arab Gulf states had just shed the Palestinians behind, and said, they just pretended that nothing happened, but actually something major happened. The Arab Peace Initiative actually does not exist anymore. This is what happened, So I was personally, yes, I was surprised because I thought that the relations will get closer and warmer, and perhaps there will be some trade office here and some, office of interest there. But I did not think that with this kind of speed, we will see one after another this kind of deals. Of course, when we knew that they are not coming, for free, that there is a toll, there is a price, attached to every such deal, whether it's F-35 to the Emirates, or whether it's the recognition of the Western Sahara as the Moroccan territory, or the exclusion of Sudan from the terror list, then of course it was quite natural. We understood why it's happening so fast, because there were presents attached at the end to everything, and still it was a surprise.
Everyone seems to be saying that the next big fish in to kind of complete this deal is Saudi Arabia, but the Biden administration seems to be taking a much sterner line with the Saudis, certainly than Donald Trump took. I think his first overseas visit was to Saudi Arabia, the one where he put his hands on the orb. It was the kind of that very weird the photo that they had taken. But the Biden administration's already signaled that they'll halt arms sales, or some arms sales, that they've called out their actions in Yemen. They were more active and kind of vocal, calling them out for the Khashoggi assassination. Aaron, do you see that at all on the horizon? Will they deal differently with Saudi Arabia, which has been such I kind of use the term loosely, an ally for the Americans? How, if are they going to come next? And if they're not going to come next, how will that relationship change?
Yeah, I mean, I think you qualified the word ally, and I think that's extremely important. An ally of the United States, in my judgment, is a country that essentially satisfies three conditions. Number one, there's a high degree of coincidence of values. Second, there is a high degree, although not necessarily across the board, because no two countries' interests align 100%, but there's a high degree of coincidence of interest. And finally, in a democratic polity like ours, we are still, there's a large amount of public support. That is to say, the public reacts favorably to country X or Y. And in part, it is that public support that allows alliance relationships to develop not over a period of 1 or 2 years, but over a period of decades. Now, I would argue to you that according to my definition, and others may have other ways of defining what a U.S. ally means, the Saudis really are lacking and deficient in all three areas. I would more accurately describe Saudi Arabia as a longstanding partner for the United States, where there is very little value coincidence, and at times, certainly under the reckless and ruthless policies of Mohammed bin Salman, a episodic degree of coincidence of interests. Now, Joe Biden has staked out a very tough position on Saudi during the campaign. It's a pariah. We don't check our principles at the door. There are going to be changes. But campaigning isn't governing, is it? And I think there are certain realities that will impose themselves that may soften to some degree the Biden administration's relationship with Saudi Arabia, and particularly with MBS. But since the Trump administration created a level of obeisance and acquiescence of American interests to Saudi, unprecedented in the history of the relationship, then I suspect that there will be a tempering between Biden and the Saudis. How the Israeli-Saudi relationship plays into this is unclear. It's complicated, and I think it's tied up in part with the Saudi succession. There are elements, including King Salman, who I think has a much more traditional perspective about what Saudi relationship with Israel should be. And I suspect there will be a price to be paid, and not only by the United States, if in fact the Saudis are going to take serious steps toward normalization with the Israelis in coming months or years.
Ksenia, did you want to chime in about Saudi Arabia in particular?
So, although we do not know what will happen in specific details in the upcoming month, I can tell you that in my feeling, I do not expect any new peace deals, specifically not with Saudi Arabia. There are many reasons why the Saudis are not in a hurry to make these relations official. There are internal reasons, of course. Saudi Arabia is a bigger country with a lot of opposition to normalization to Israel. There are a lot of radicals. There are still the class of the religious ulama who object, immensely, any peace deal with Israel. It can also complicate the relations, already tense relations with the Iranians. In any case, it's a price that Saudis will be willing, perhaps, to give to an American president. Israel is secondary in this regard. If they will receive something that is important for them from the United States. For example, if they will be left alone on the issue of the human rights, which personally, I do not think that this is something that is about to happen. And the last thing that is important to underline, that it doesn't matter so much whether the relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia right now are official. It is important, of course, for the prime minister and to some other people. But I think the strategic interests, there is no doubt that they coincide. We have common enemies, and it's not only Iran, but also Turkey, that despite its being signaling for the last few weeks that it's very interested to warm the relations with both Saudis and Israel, for now, there is no change of, there's no deep and ideological change there. And until it will not happen, I think that Israel and Saudi will have a lot interest to share and to work with each other, whether it will be discreet, more discreet, or at some point even open relation.
That will certainly be one to watch in the next little bit. And I dare say some of it may also be a product of what happens in the Israeli elections over the next few months as well, and how that plays out. And that's a way that I wanted to segue into talking about NIF's, I guess, more core business, specifically in Israel and the Palestinian territories. Something I was very interested to hear was Antony Blinken's confirmation hearing, where he really anchored Joe Biden's moderate pro-Israel credentials as he spoke about what the plans for the administration were in his role as Secretary of State. And he said Israeli security was the bedrock of America's commitment. There was a lot of talk about Israeli security and not a lot of talk about human rights and democracy and Palestinian human rights, which what I was thinking was that if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren had been the nominee and become president, it would have been a very different framing of the Israeli-American relationship. Do you think, maybe Aaron, start with you, do you think there'll be pressure on Joe Biden from kind of more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, or even the liberal wing of the Jewish community from J Street and others, to place more pressure on Israel in order to bring them back to the table, make sure that the free pass that Trump gave them isn't extended even further?
Yeah, there'll be pressure, but again, the Constitution and the discretion that presidents have to deal with foreign policy will make that pressure, in my judgment, not terribly consequential. And it comes back to priorities, at least in the Middle East. Barack Obama's relationship with Netanyahu was like a roller coaster soap opera for many different reasons. But one of them was that Obama took on two of the most sensitive issues for the Israeli body politic and for Mr. Netanyahu in particular at the same time. 2 days after the inauguration, he stood at the State Department, flanked by Hillary Clinton on one hand and George Mitchell on the other, announcing an initiative, settlements freeze, George Mitchell special envoy, a lot of tough rhetoric, which amounted to nothing, frankly. And he also took on the Iran issue, which is, frankly, in Mr. Netanyahu's view, and the view of many Israelis then, much more consequential with respect to Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missiles, and its role in the region. I don't think Mr. Biden is going to go down that road of the double barrel approach. And I think he's made a virtue out of necessity. Frankly, Iran, why is Iran so important to Joe Biden? Is it because he has some passion for transforming the U.S.-Iranian relationship? Is it because he loves to negotiate? No. It's because Iran is the only issue out there in this broken, angry, dysfunctional Middle East that has the potential to create regional war that could ultimately draw in the United States, affect the flow of oil, financial markets, and distract and undermine Mr. Biden's core priority, which is not fixing the Middle East. It's repairing America's broken house. So in my view, Tony Blinken was turning a virtue to a necessity. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, by any rational standard, unless you're somehow affected by interminable obtuseness, is nowhere near the kind of prime time for resolution. And everybody knows that, maybe with the exception of many progressives or the left in the United States, or what remains, frankly, of the left in Israel. I'd be stunned if the Labor Party, for the first time in the history of the state, the party that was the driver, the engineer, not just of pre-statehood, but of the first 30 years of Israel's existence, didn't pass the electoral threshold. Stunning to me what's happened. So I think that it's not that Joe Biden will give Netanyahu a pass, but I think unless Mr. Netanyahu brings this on himself by a rash of settlement activity which crosses red lines, flirts again with the prospects of annexation, which will screw up his relationship with the Emiratis, of course, and others, I think Mr. Biden will give him some space. You may hear tougher talk. Ksenia is right. The salad days of the Trump administration with Bibi Netanyahu are over. But the notion that the Biden administration is they bring serious pressure on Netanyahu at the same time they're trying to figure out a way to get back into the JCPOA strikes me as a bad strategy and bad tactics, and I don't think the Biden administration is going to pursue it.
Ksenia, did you want to?
So with Netanyahu still in government and possibly also after the 23rd of March, we do not know what will happen, with Abu Mazen, who is 85 years old now, and with the question of the elections in Palestinian autonomy, which might or might not happen, we still have the same old players that, although they despise each other, but they have learned to accommodate to each other in not a bad fashion. So if, as was correctly said right now, if there will be no rocking the boat by any of the sides, and the relative calm will persevere during at least this year, we saw that the Qataris pledged to Gaza increased support and so on in order to make things quiet and calm for the time being. So I do not foresee neither substantial pressure to resume the negotiations, because I think that also the members of Biden team, they are accustomed and they know very well exactly what is who are the main players on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. However, if there will be power transition during the next few months, perhaps years, in Ramallah and in Jerusalem, then we might see, some kind of activity, because there will be a window of opportunity. Right now, I do not see any window of opportunity with pressure, without pressure. And yet again, it's good that we already have seen the reverse from Trump's administration decisions to bring back the U.S. aid, to resume the activities of the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem and the PLO office in Washington.
The annexation issue was really a product of, 3 successive Israeli election campaigns, where it felt like Bibi had to keep doubling down on promises in order to keep trying to get votes from his right and to shore up his base, and that he was in the end boxed in and felt like he had to do something, when I think the commentary, really, the consensus was that he really would not have done it. He would have much rather stuck with the status quo if he could have. That feels like that could be a trigger again, that if Netanyahu starts getting desperate closer to the election, that he does maybe try and cross those, either advertently or inadvertently cross those red lines that you were talking about, both of you. But does that mean that if there isn't action on the Israeli-Palestinian front, let's assume that things remain relatively the same, does that mean that these 4 years maybe of Joe Biden's term, is this the last chance, though, of the two-state solution? What happens if there is no solution in the next 4 years, if there is no movement? Do we end up in a worse place for that then than we are in now? Aaron, do you want to
go? It's hard to imagine. Well, it isn't hard to imagine the situation deteriorating. You have, by and large, and have had for decades now, what I call the sustainable, unsustainable status quo. And all of the projections that the left and the peace camp, and frankly, even some of them I shared when I was working, that unless Israel settled up with the Palestinians, it would essentially become a pariah nation. Not only hasn't it proven true, it's somehow been, profoundly reversed. It's stunning to me, and I can't explain it. Maybe Ksenia can explain it. How is it possible for a conservative Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has dominated Israeli politics for the last decade, who has contributed, certainly through his intentions, how impactful it's been is another matter, to the settlement enterprise, who makes no excuses. I'm just reporting here. Benjamin Netanyahu was not put on this earth, in his view, to become the father, mother, midwife of a Palestinian state based something on June 67 borders with a real Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem. But Israel's diplomatic representation in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in Africa, and now in what the Palestinians, I'm sure, believe is the ultimate betrayal, breaking the red lines in the region, and watching the Arab states, not the public so much, but the regimes untether themselves from the Palestinian cause. There's not a single nation in the world today of the 193 that sit in the UN that's prepared to make the achievement of a Palestinian state a national priority. So I'm amazed by this, frankly. I mean, all of these projections have been wrong. Now, Israel still confronts the reality. It has all these Palestinians that it controls directly, indirectly, between the sea and the river. The demographics are bad. It's having an impact on Israeli democracy. And the very identity of the state, we're told, is going to be up for grabs if the situation is not somehow resolved. But frankly, I mean, I'm 71 years old. Unless you have two leaders that emerge, a de Klerk and a Mandela, and I don't see that on either side, frankly, you're going to be stuck with where we are with varying outcomes, some accommodation, some violence, some explosions, maybe another war between Israel and Hamas. I think that you're trapped for the foreseeable future in space between a two-state solution that's still too important to abandon, in my judgment, on one hand, but simply impossible to implement on the other. And I would not insult either of your intelligences or the viewer's intelligence by trying to project what the arc of this trajectory is going to look like. It ain't going to be great, that's for sure.
Ksenia?
So, as I said earlier, I think that there is a lot of weight and a lot of influence will be if there will be the transition of power that will occur specifically in Ramallah, but also in Jerusalem, and that there will be a new dynamic between the respective players. We do not know what they will bring. It seems right now that the situation is quite calm and there is some kind of a status quo. But as we know, the status quo never, it's not an eternal thing, especially not in the Middle East. And things can change very, very quickly. So if there will be no decision, there will be no change for the better during the next 4 years, there will certainly be more settlement growth. There will be less hope on the Israeli side, I think, for sure, and also for the Palestinian, that a two-state solution is possible. And therefore, the support for the idea of a one-state solution will grow. And we see already some indication to that in the public polls of the Palestinian population. In West Bank, the young people who were born into the Second Intifada flames, and after that, they simply do not believe that there is such a thing, a two-state solution. So we will lose in 4 years the majority, or at least the half of the population that supports the two-state solution right now. And we will get, in the end of the day, a situation in which there will be no possibility to implement the two-state solution. And therefore, the only reality that we will have of this will be of one state between the river and the sea.
We're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. I want to try and end on something positive. So I'm reaching out now to both of you to give me, and I guess everybody watching at home, a little bit of hope. I wonder if it's looking towards renewal in the United States and at least being on the right foot to repair some of what seems to be so broken. Maybe it's Kamala Harris as vice president and a kind of new generation of leader coming through. Maybe it's something in the Israeli election. There seems to be a kind of some new dynamics taking shape that maybe we'll find out more about next week. Do either of you want to give us something to hold on to?
If I may begin.
Yeah, go.
It seems to me that, first of all, a lot of the Israelis, certainly those who had voted against Benjamin Netanyahu during the last three sets of elections, but also before, and we are talking about the majority. Netanyahu didn't win the hearts of 50% of Israelis, or even 40% or 70%. So I think they were very encouraged by the victory of the President Joe Biden and the new team, the speed with which he is unmaking the harm that was done by the previous administration. And indeed, we see, at least for now, I cannot tell you, and nobody can, I think, tell you what will happen before March 23rd. But for now, we see a dynamic that gives us a little hope that at least there is a chance to see the majority of the Israeli political players, although the left, of course, is until now it's very weak. But even there, we now have Merav Michaeli, a woman who is heading the Labour Party and bringing a little bit of the, its lost dignity back. So the dynamics are certainly changing. It's changing in the United States, and it's sending this some of kind of a shock waves also here to the Middle East, specifically to Israel. Yes, since all of us, 9.5 million of Israelis, we continue to live where we are, it makes us automatically optimists. We are optimists, and therefore we have to, hope and also work for the future of ourselves and our children. I personally is inclined to see, the current era is slightly better than it used to be before the American elections.
That's there is something there, definitely. Aaron, did you want to add?
I mean, I'd only add that I've never seen Israel as a victim. I mean, I realize the odds arrayed against it from its inception have been very great, but it has demonstrated a degree of resilience, creativity, and fortitude that is incredibly impressive. Israel is not a piece of driftwood somehow floating aimlessly on a turbulent sea. It has agency. It has the capacity to defend and protect itself. And frankly, right now, I'm much less worried. Understandably, I'm not an Israeli, about what's happening here than I am in Israel. And the two are connected, to be sure. The United States is Israel's erstwhile ally. Our interests do not coincide across the board, but the nature of our support based on value affinity, most Americans still, millions in the evangelical community, see Israel as a democratic, pluralist policy that reflects not Christian values, but reflects American values. I need to be optimistic about what's happening to the Republic, because I can't really accept any other alternative. We've been through terrible crises before. I tried to convince a millennial the other day that 1968 was a worse year than 2019. No sale. Thousands of Americans were dying in Vietnam. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. You had race riots in 100 U.S. cities, including this one, which claimed the lives, double the numbers of humans who were killed in Capitol Hill, and 1,000 were wounded. And then the Chicago Convention. I would basically conclude by quoting the last American president that really had an influence on me, Jack Kennedy, emotional influence. I was 12 when he was murdered. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. Never give up on the fact that the world can be changed, you can be changed. A very difficult situation can be changed. But as you go through the process of transformation, you must go through without illusions, with your eyes wide open. So I guess, Liam and Ksenia, I would describe myself as an idealist without illusion. And I think, frankly, I'm somewhat optimistic that with that attitude, America will slowly, gradually begin to right itself.
That seems like a wonderful note to finish on from both of you. So I do think we have to wrap up, and I really want to say thank you for joining us all the way down in Australia. I hope that one day we can get both of you out here to sit on a stage and help us contextualize everything that's happening in person as well. It'll certainly be very interesting to see how this all plays out. Let's hope certainly for a smoother ride maybe in 2021 than we've had over the last months or even years as well. Thank you to everyone for joining us at home. Like I said, more than 500 people, which is wonderful. We've got some great events coming up in the next few months, including the Australian premiere screening of the film Comrade Dov with our friends at the Jewish International Film Festival. It's an insightful and actually very heartwarming and optimistic story about the former Knesset member Dov Chenin, who represented the Hadash party in the Knesset for many years. You'll be able to see the great trailer actually on our website, which features President Rivlin, Merav Michaeli, a number of characters that everyone will know from Israeli politics from right across the political spectrum where he was widely respected. And I know that we'll also have some Israeli election content coming out soon, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. The last thing that I always like to do, of course, is remind everyone to help support and contribute to the work of the New Israel Fund. I know that Erin obviously is a board member and is very dedicated to the NIF cause, and Ksenia as someone who works with the Mitvim Institute, which is a grantee of NIF Israel, an organisation that I know greatly admire the reports and commentary that come out of there. It's important that we all band together at these times to try and realise the vision that we all have of a pluralist, equal and democratic future for all Israelis. So I'd encourage everybody to remember the things that are happening around the world and to help contribute to the work of the New Israel Fund. As you finish this event, you'll be pumped out to a donation page, so feel free to use that page wisely. Again, one last thank you to Erin and Ksenia for joining us. Hope that you both stay safe and healthy, as of course I wish that hope on everyone who's watching at home. Look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.